This happened to my brother and I in the summer of '95. I was 24 and he was 22. We lived with our mom out in the open desert at a place called Whispering Ranch, which was about 10 to 20 miles in any direction from the nearest town. The roads weren't paved and we did not have electricity or running water. Because of that, we had to haul our water in from town. The only means of light we had were kerosene lanterns and flashlights. One day, our mom asked us if we could walk down to her friend John's place and pick up some tools she needed for a project she was going to do the next day. We told her yeah, then headed out across the desert. It took less time because John lived about a mile away. There would still be half a mile between us and the road to John's house. So anyway, we get to John's and sit under the shade to drink some water while he goes and gets the tools for our mom. He comes back and gives us the tools. We put them down and decided to stay and visit a little, because it was scorching. After the sunset, we realized it had gotten darker. The only means of light that we had was a flashlight. We told him we had to leave, so we grabbed the tools for our mom and said goodbye. We left and started to walk down the road. While walking home, we decided to cut across the desert to get home faster. We got halfway across the desert before it sounded like something was following us. At first, we didn't pay attention to it because out there, it wasn't uncommon to hear an animal at night. The further we walked, the sound of something breathing got closer and closer. My brother stopped and turned to see what was following us. That's when he saw it. 2 glowing red eyes staring at us. He tugged my arm, shushing me. He told me to move slowly, be quiet, and don't look back. I didn't listen to him. Turning around, I saw the eyes and screamed. We took off running towards our mom's, and that's when it started chasing us. I ended up tripping, hitting my face on the ground. Between the night sky and our light, there was no telling where we were going. When I got up, I saw the red eyes. I screamed for my brother. He came back and grabbed me, shoving the flashlight in my hand. We started running again, and so did the thing chasing us. By this time, we were scared. There was nothing to protect us from whatever was chasing us. Somehow, for a brief moment, my brother and I got separated. That's when I fell again, rolling over onto my back. I sat up, pointing the flashlight into the direction of the animal. That's when we saw what was chasing us. It was huge. I imagined if it stood, it would be about 8 feet tall. It had long, shiny black hair, a snout like a wolf, long, sharp claws, and it smelled like rotten flesh. It snarled at us, looking with its dead cold eyes. We were scared, frozen in place at the sight in front of us. My brother snapped out of his trance, dragging me up to my feet. We wasted no time running, as the creature screeched at us with a horrendous force. The creature pursued us quickly. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my legs. I thought it was going to get me at any second. Just then, the light of a bonfire came into view. We ran towards it, seeing my mom and family members. We collapsed in front of them, terrified, and for a few minutes, couldn't even talk. They looked at us in confusion, wondering what we were worked up about. When we told them what had happened, nobody believed us. They laughed and called us chickens because they thought there was nothing to be afraid of. The next morning I woke up and went into the kitchen. My mom looks at me, wide-eyed. In a shocked tone, she yells at me, "Patricia, come here. What is that on the back of your leg?" Confused, I replied, "What do you mean, Mom?" She points to my thigh. "Look!" On my right thigh, there are 3 large scratch marks, almost blood red. Last night during the chase, it must have scratched me. I guess I didn't notice at the time due to the adrenaline rushing through me. Well, needless to say, we never walked out there after dark again. This happened to me in my little town in Arkansas, near Beech Grove. Me and my mom and dad lived out in the boonies, and we were surrounded by a lot of bog and swamp. I remember being a little kid and hearing screams out in the swamp at night, and always being afraid to go out there. My father has always been hunting and into the outdoors, always told me he never heard of that, and then there's nothing to be afraid of. This screaming and howling went on for nights. I would hear it all throughout the night, almost every night, and it would keep me up. There would be nights I would look out my window and not see anything, but just hear the screams. I remember one night in particular was really humid, more than usual, and I was having a tough time falling asleep. I hadn't heard any howls this night, but for whatever reason, something in my gut told me to get up and look out the window. I got up out of bed and approached my window and looked out. At first, I didn't see anything until I turned my head to the left. About 50 feet to 100 feet away, I see this large black mass with pointy ears and glowing yellow eyes, what looked to be wobbling in our house's direction. I screamed bloody murder and hid under my covers. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I remember waking up to the sound of tapping on my window and breathing. I was too freaked out to even pull my head out of the covers to see what it was. The tapping went on for a little bit though, and it kept me awake. At some point though, day broke, and I remember waking up to hearing my dad whooping and hollering outside. My dad comes back in the house with his cup of coffee and says one of the neighbors must have gotten a huge dog because it walked right through our property last night and left huge prints. My dad is not educated at all when it comes to dogs, so to him, this is just a large dog that had to come through our property, and he assumed it was the neighbors. This scared me, because even though I haven't really watched any werewolf or horror movies, I thought it was a monster. The same one that came at me last night, and I realized it wasn't a nightmare. My dad was pretty irritated that there were so many prints in the muck and soil, so he talked with the neighbors and they don't even have dogs. He's so convinced some large dog found its way through our property. He wouldn't be wrong. I believe it was a large dog. That large dog being a dogman. I'll never forget the day my grandfather passed away. This would have been January 2009. My grandfather and I were very close, largely in part to my father passing at a very young age due to medical complications. I don't really remember my father a whole lot, but I grew up extremely close to my granddad. At the time this happened, I was 26 and working a local security job. My grandfather lived about 2 hours away from me. Keep in mind this was in the dead of winter, and there's a lot of snow and ice on the roads. I got the call early in the morning, about 5 o'clock, that he never woke up. My grandfather is usually up at 3 in the morning. He always used to go to bed at 6 or 7 in the evening. I fly in my car out to my grandparents' house. Because they live so far out, there's certain old highways and roads I must take to get to them, and with snow and ice it becomes a very treacherous situation, very fast. As painful as it was losing my grandfather that day, something else happened to me that terrified me to my core. I'm almost to my grandparents, and I'm pulling up on this long dirt road, which is around 6 miles, with their house near the end. They lived in the sticks, and I'm surrounded by pine and fir all around me. I see what I can make out to be a large animal eating a dead deer in the middle of the road. I pulled up slowly, and this thing turns around and stands up on 2 legs. Now let me explain something. As I pulled up to it, it looks weird to begin with, because it looked as if it was this half-man, half-wolf crouching, and I was seeing its backside. But once it turned its head at me and stood up, I slammed on my brakes. I gasped in fear. This thing didn't stare at me more than 2 seconds before it crouched slightly and leaped up into the air and disappeared. I couldn't stop screaming and slammed the acceleration. I nearly lost control of the car and crashed. I somehow managed to fly down this snowy ice road without crashing, eventually reaching my grandparents' house only minutes later. There was already a police officer at the house and several of my other family members. Even though I was overwhelmed by sadness and despair, I pulled the police officer aside and asked him if he saw anything driving up here, and the cop just looked at me strangely and told me no. Nothing else was said, and I comforted my grandmother, and my family stayed with us there for a few days to take care of my grandmother. Part of me wonders if what I saw that night was the evil that followed him around. My grandmother would tell me that he had a darkness surrounding him, and she never really elaborated, so I always understood that as a figure of speech for bad luck. But maybe she meant something more. I found out that when he was much younger, he dabbled in witchcraft for a short while. I have no idea if what I saw is related to that at all, but judging by what I've researched from the encounters that I read, I can only make an educated speculation.